The afternoon sun over Nadzab Airfield in New Guinea was a pale, washed-out disk, the kind of heat-bleached light that made depth and distance disappear. It was the middle of the dry season in the early months of 1944, and the dust on the ground rose in thin, spectral layers every time someone walked across the hard, packed earth. At the far end of the North Dispersal area, a single P-38 Lightning idled at low throttle, its twin Allisons beating a slow, uneven rhythm, as if unsure whether the engines wanted to settle or surge. The propellers spun lazily, throwing shimmering arcs of distortion into the hot air. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Harold Red Talbot squinted at the coolant temperature gauge and watched the needle creep higher than he liked. Behind him, a mechanic stood, on a metal stepladder, with his head buried inside the right-side engine cowling. Red could not see his hands, but he could hear the short, clipped movements of metal on metal and an occasional muttered curse that only came from someone who had lived too long with machinery that refused to behave. The mechanic's name was Victor Line, 23 years old, a former farmhand from northern Michigan, and one of those men whose calm competence could make a pilot trust an airplane he had no business trusting. Red knew him only through the habit shared by every combat pilot. You watched the crew chief's face, not the instruments, when your own life rested on whether the aircraft was fit to fly. And Victor's face never seemed rattled, even on mornings when the humidity climbed so high that fuel pumps groaned and coolant lines wept condensation like they were alive. But this afternoon, even Victor was not calm. Red caught a glimpse of him, leaning out of the cowling, pushing his goggles, back up into his hairline. The expression he wore was not worry. Victor rarely worried, but calculation. Something had changed in the engine's behavior. Something subtle enough that only someone who had spent too many sleepless nights reading maintenance bulletins by lantern light could detect it. Red throttled back one notch and yelled up to him, "She's still running hot!" Victor wiped his wrist across his forehead, leaving a thin streak of grease that looked like war paint. "I know," he shouted over the engines. "Give me another minute." A minute turned into several, and when Victor climbed down, Red finally saw the truth written plainly on the mechanic's face. The aircraft was not overheated because the radiator shutters were stuck or because the carburetor mixture was running rich. The problem was deeper. Something about the engine's thermal balance had shifted, and not in a direction they wanted. That was the inciting moment, the one Red would remember, years later. Not the firefights, not the dogfights, not the flashes of anti-aircraft shells at 20,000 feet. It was this small, quiet hesitation on a dusty Pacific airfield. The moment when a pilot realized that the man who kept him alive was about to attempt something the manuals would never approve. And it was also the moment Victor understood that he had run out of acceptable options. The P-38 Lightning was an extraordinary machine, fast, heavily armed, stable at altitude, and capable of operating in conditions that defeated most single-engine fighters. But it had its weaknesses. The Allisons relied on liquid cooling, which meant the engines were only as good as the coolant running through them. In the brutal heat of the Southwest Pacific, overheating was not a rare inconvenience. It was a constant threat. And when the turbo superchargers forced more oxygen into the combustion chambers at high altitude, coolant temperatures could spike with frightening speed. Pilots knew the procedure: manage the throttle, watch the temperatures, avoid aggressive climb angles when the air was thin. But in 1944, the strategic situation demanded more from the Lightning than its designers had anticipated. Long-range escort missions over New Guinea and the Bismarck Sea forced the aircraft into long climbs at heavy weight. Reconnaissance runs required altitudes near 30,000 feet, where the summer sun beat down on the radiators even as the ambient temperature dropped below freezing. And on some missions, where the Japanese sent their Ki-44 interceptors up to unprecedented heights, American pilots began scraping the upper edge of the P-38's performance envelope far more often than the textbooks recommended. Ground crews adapted. They improvised air filters out of canvas, adjusted turbo controller linkages with hand-filed shims, and tightened coolant fittings until their knuckles bled. But nothing solved the deeper problem: the coolant itself. The official mixture, ethylene glycol blended with water and rust inhibitor, worked well under most conditions. But in the harshest climates, its thermal stability was not ideal, and its boiling point margin shrank when the cooling system picked up even minor internal scaling. The Army Air Forces were aware of this, and engineering teams stateside were studying the problem. But out here, on an island thousands of miles from California, pilots did not have the luxury of waiting for revised service bulletins. Victor knew this too. He had spent nights reading through engineering manuals, comparing boiling curves, and studying notes scribbled in the margins of mechanic guides by men who had served in Alaska, where extreme cold produced similar headaches for the cooling systems. He even kept a small notebook filled with hand-drawn temperature flow charts that were decidedly unofficial. The Army never asked him to do this. He simply believed that a man responsible for maintaining a precision machine needed to understand every facet of how it worked. That afternoon, as Red throttled the engines down and shut them off, Victor motioned him over to a small workbench just outside the maintenance tent. Flies buzzed lazily around open fuel cans. The air smelled of solvent, hot metal, and spilled hydraulic fluid. Victor placed a canteen cup and a small vial on the table. "I think I know why she's been running hot," he said. "We're getting microfoaming in the coolant lines." Red frowned. "Foaming? At this heat?" "At altitude," Victor corrected him. "You climb too fast with the shutters cracked open. The fluid cavitates in the pump. It starts forming tiny pockets of vapor. The coolant's boiling point drops just enough to cause trouble." "How bad?" "Bad enough that you're not going up again today unless we fix it." "Neither of them," said the obvious. Refusing a mission was not an option. Their squadron was, flying long-range escort for a reconnaissance flight the next morning. The recon pilots depended on lightning cover to keep Japanese fighters from tearing the slow photoships apart. A malfunctioning cooling system jeopardized not only Red's aircraft but the mission's success. Victor held up the small vial. "I've been reading a set of notes from the cold weather detachments in Alaska. They were having cavitation problems too. They solved it by adjusting the mixture. Not a lot, just enough to change the surface tension and heat transfer properties." Red raised an eyebrow. "That's not regulation," Victor finished. "I know. What happens if you're wrong?" Victor looked at the Lightning parked a few yards away. Dust clung to its tires. The paint around the radiators was stained from months of tropical humidity. "If I'm wrong, the worst that happens is what's already happening. She runs hot. You throttle back. You come home early. And if you're right?" Red asked. Victor did not answer immediately. Instead, he unscrewed the canteen cap and poured a small amount of clear liquid into the cup. Then he added a measured drop from the vial. The mixture swirled briefly, then settled. Nothing about it looked unusual. There was no smoke, no color shift, no smell. But Victor's eyes did not leave the cup. "If I'm right," he finally said, "you'll have enough thermal margin to climb higher without overheating." "How much higher?" Victor hesitated again, this time for longer. "High enough that the Japanese won't expect you." Red stared at the cup, trying to imagine what high enough meant in the context of a Lightning. The P-38 could reach service ceilings above 39,000 feet under ideal conditions. In practice, Fully equipped fighters rarely operated that high, but Japanese fighters like the Ki-44 and the later Ki-43 variants could make interception attempts, well above 25,000 feet. Battles at altitude were becoming increasingly common. Every additional 1,000 feet of margin mattered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victor picked up the vial and held it between his fingers. This isn't magic. It won't give you more horsepower. It won't make the airframe safer at the top of the climb. But it might stop the overheating that's been killing us on these long climbs. I tested the mix at the bench best I can do without a lab. Red nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Permission, Victor replied. No one in the chain will sign off on this, but the aircraft belongs to you. If you say no, I drain the lines, and we keep fighting the way we have been. If you say yes, I make the change now and monitor it through ground runs. Pilots made life and death decisions thousands of times. During the war, turn left or turn right, dive or climb, attack or disengage. But rare were the decisions where a pilot was asked to stake his survival on the private calculations of a mechanic who had never flown a combat sortie. And yet, Red realized, those calculations might be the difference between limping home with overheated engines or establishing high-altitude dominance in the next encounter. He finally said, "Do it." Victor nodded once, as if nothing more needed to be said, and walked toward the aircraft. Red watched him disappear beneath the wing, wrench in hand, knowing he had just agreed to something that would never appear in a maintenance log. What neither of them understood in that moment was how consequential that decision would become, not just for Red, not just for their squadron, but for a series of encounters in the months to come when Lightning pilots found themselves climbing higher and holding altitude longer than the Japanese believed possible. They also did not know how dangerous it was. Changing coolant mixtures, even slightly, altered radiator behavior, corrosion characteristics, and pump loading. Any mechanic with ordinary confidence would never attempt it. But Victor was not ordinary. He believed that if a machine had a weakness, the answer was not to accept it, it was to study the weakness until it broke under the weight of understanding. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Owen Stanley Range and the mosquitoes came out in swarms thick enough to haze the air, Victor completed the coolant purge and recharge. He ran the engines at incremental throttle settings, checking temperatures with a battered field pyrometer. He listened to the coolant pumps with his bare hand pressed against the engine cowling, feeling for the faint tremors that betrayed cavitation. He adjusted the radiator shutters manually and verified that thermal load stabilized faster than before. By nightfall, he was satisfied. Red, sitting on an overturned fuel drum, watched him close the cowling panels. "Well?" the pilot asked. Victor wiped his hands again. "You'll see it in the climb. She'll run cooler." "How much cooler?" "Cool enough," Victor said. Neither man claimed to know more than that. Neither had charts, laboratory measurements, or metallurgical analysis to prove anything. All they had was instinct, experience, and the quiet belief that necessity forces solutions long before official channels catch up. And somewhere above the darkening Pacific, where the humidity turned the horizon into a smear of fading orange, the limits of the P-38 Lightning were about to shift imperceptibly at first. Then, dramatically, as the weeks unfolded, Brenner spent the next 2 days moving through the maintenance bay like he was carrying a secret war on his shoulders. While the rest of the ground crew heard the clang of tools and the chatter of pilots, he heard the ticking clock of engines that were running out of time. Every hour a P-38 went up with standard coolant was another hour a pilot risked being trapped inside a boiling metal trap at altitude. The younger mechanics whispered about him. Some said he was trying to reinvent the airplane. Others said he was losing sleep and losing his mind with it. But those closest to the flight line knew better. Brenner wasn't the kind of man who experimented for pride. He experimented because he hated funerals. By midday of the third day, Master Sergeant Doyle finally confronted him. Brenner was elbow-deep in a mixing drum, moving a stir rod with the precision of a chemist and the tension of a man disarming a bomb. "Hal," Doyle said softly, "the colonel's starting to ask why you're treating coolant like it's a live grenade." Brenner didn't stop stirring. "What exactly is he asking? He wants to know if you're making a problem or solving one." Brenner lifted the rod out of the mixture, watching the thin, oily strands drip back into the drum. "The factory coolant boils at 18,000 feet, he muttered. "Your boys are dogfighting at 35. If I don't fix this, Doyle, we're sending them up in coffins." Doyle's face tightened. He'd read enough engine failure reports to know Brenner wasn't exaggerating. More than one Lightning had come back with cylinders scorched, coolant lines burst, or worse, never come back at all. That night, after the flight line went dark and the pilots wandered off to their tents, Brenner stayed behind. The maintenance bay transformed under the single, flickering bulb above his bench. Shadows stretched across dismantled engine blocks and rows of hoses that still smelled faintly of burnt glycol. He pulled out the small notebook he always kept tucked into his breast pocket. Inside were pages filled with chemical ratios, imperfect formulas, pressure calculations, and small angry notes from nights when physics refused to cooperate. But on the last page, circled twice in pencil, was the idea that had been haunting him. Ethylene glycol mixed with methanol and water balanced just right, a blend that no manual approved, a blend the army would never authorize, a blend that, if off by a margin, could seize an engine so violently it would tear itself apart in mid-air. He stared at it for a long moment, running his thumb over the ink. He wasn't supposed to think like this. He wasn't supposed to try things that weren't on a parts list. But pilots were dying, and factories were far away, and the desert didn't care about regulations. Impossible mixture, the engineering manuals called it. Brenner whispered back to the empty room. "Then I guess we'll have to make the impossible work." He began measuring, pouring, adjusting minute amounts at a time. Drops, not ounces. Ratios that would make sense only to the man who had been listening to engines more faithfully than he listened to sleep. By the time the desert wind slid, through the open hangar doors and the candle-thin light of dawn crept under the metal siding, Brenner's eyes were red, his hands were trembling, and the drum in front of him held the liquid that might either save the squadron or bury it. He dipped a finger into the mixture, rubbed it between his gloved fingertips, feeling the viscosity like a pianist testing the keys of a new instrument. "This is it," he whispered, but he still had one impossible problem left to solve. Someone had to fly with it. Brenner didn't sleep. He just paced the edge of the hangar, staring at the metal drum like it was a secret he wasn't sure the world was ready for. By the time the sun pulled itself over the desert ridge, pilots began drifting toward the flight line, boots kicking up dust, goggles hanging loose around their necks. They looked tired, but not in the way Brenner was. Their fatigue came from missions. His came from the fear that he might send one of them to their death. Captain Wesley. Hart was the first to notice him standing there alone. Hart was tall, sharp-featured, a pilot who walked like he was already halfway in the cockpit. He spotted the mixing drum behind Brenner and gave a slow whistle. "You been cooking moonshine out here?" Hart joked, nudging him with an elbow. Brenner didn't laugh. Hart's smile faded. "Hal, what did you do?" Brenner lifted the lid just enough for Hart to smell the faint chemical bite rising from inside. Hart wrinkled his nose. "That's not factory coolant." "No," Brenner replied quietly. "It's something better." Hart studied him for a long moment. "Or something worse." The hangar was waking up now, air compressors switching on, wrenches clattering, the distant sound of an Allison engine coughing itself awake. Brenner knew he had only seconds before Doyle or some officer demanded an explanation. "Hart," he said, almost pleading. "Your engines aren't surviving the climbs. You know that. This mix, it raises the boil point by almost 30%. It stays stable longer. It won't flash vapor at altitude." His voice dropped. "It might just let you boys fight where the air gets thin." Hart didn't move. He was weighing something heavier than risk. He was weighing trust. After a long moment, he tapped the side of the mixing drum. "You tested it?" "Only on the bench rig," Brenner admitted. "No airframe, no heat cycles, no combat throttle. So no actual engine has run on it." Brenner shook his head. Hart exhaled slowly. Then he did the one thing Brenner didn't expect. He stuck out his hand. "Load my Lightning." Brenner blinked. "Hart, no. I didn't. This isn't." "Load it," Hart said firmly. "If you believe in it, I'll fly with it." Brenner's throat tightened. The desert suddenly felt too quiet, too still. "You're trusting me with your life," he whispered. Hart shook his head. "No, I'm trusting you with your work. The two aren't the same." Minutes later, the ground crew rolled Hart's P-38 from the shade of the bay into the sunlight. Its twin booms gleamed silver beneath the morning sky, shark-like, hungry. Brenner watched as mechanics drained the old coolant, hooked up fresh lines, and fed Hart's aircraft with the pale, experimental mixture. Every drop felt like a gamble. When Hart climbed the ladder and slid into the cockpit, the world seemed to shrink around Brenner. He watched the pilot settle into his seat, adjust his harness, and give a small salute through the canopy, a gesture Brenner had seen 100 times, but never directed at him. The propellers began to turn, blades slicing the air faster and faster until the engines caught with a deep, resonant growl. The hangar doors rattled, dust spiraled around the wheels, the smell of fuel and hot metal filled the air. Brenner held his breath. The temperature gauge on the ground test trolley began to climb. Normal. Normal. A little higher. Still normal. Hart eased the throttles forward. The P-38 rolled out of the bay, nose lifting slightly, engines spooling like two angry beasts waking from sleep. Brenner's hands were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. If the mixture failed, it wouldn't happen on takeoff. It would happen up there, where no one could help him. Hart taxied to the end of the strip, turned, held the brakes, revved the engines to combat power for just a moment. The gauges trembled. Then he released the brakes. The P-38 surged forward, kicking up a long plume of dust behind it. Brenner watched it accelerate, faster, faster, until finally the wheels lifted from the earth and the lightning clawed its way into the morning sky. Brenner didn't realize he had stopped breathing until the aircraft vanished into the glare of the sun. Now there was nothing to do but wait. Minutes passed like hours. Brenner stood beside the empty runway with his thumb hooked into his belt, trying to look calm, but every mechanic around him could see the tension in his jaw. The desert air shimmered in the heat, warping the horizon until even the mountains looked like they were breathing. Somewhere up there, somewhere invisible, inside the glare, Hart was climbing. Doyle approached slowly, hands shoved into his pockets. "You really think that mix will hold?" Brenner didn't answer. He couldn't. He was watching the sky like a man waiting for a verdict from God. The first sign came as a faint, distant hum so soft it might have been imagined. Then the hum deepened into a steady drone, building until it separated into two clean, rising notes from twin Allison engines. The sound was higher than normal, sharper. He was high. Very high. But the engines were still running. The mechanics began gathering by the hangar doors. Some shaded their eyes, others exchanged uneasy glances, a few prayed under their breath. The P-38 finally reappeared, dropping out of a pale strip of sky like a silver dart. It wasn't descending in a lazy testing circle either. Hart was pushing it, diving hard, pulling up, rolling once, twice. He was trying to make it fail. Brenner felt a painful throb in his chest. "Come on, Hart, don't cook her." The lightning screamed across the runway at low level, engines roaring, the sound vibrating the sheet metal walls of the bay. The temperature gauge on the ground trolley, still linked to Hart's instruments, spat out numbers hotter, hotter, then stabilizing. Not dropping, not spiking, stable. Doyle's eyes widened. "He's not boiling over." Brenner didn't respond. He was staring at the numbers like they were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Up in the cockpit, Hart yanked the throttles forward again, rolling into a steep vertical climb. The lightning clawed upward, the engines howling, the mixture inside them pushed to the edge of physics. Still stable. Hart leveled off into a high-speed pass, and then finally came down in a smooth, confident glide toward the strip. The tires kissed the runway, bounced once, then settled. Dust billowed behind the wheels as the aircraft slowed and rolled toward the hangar. When the canopy opened, Hart didn't climb out right away. He just sat there, breathing hard, letting the cooling engines tick and crackle beneath him. Brenner walked toward the aircraft as if approaching a wounded animal, slow, unsure, half afraid it might collapse now that the trial was over. Hart finally swung a leg over the cockpit edge. Sweat streaked the sides of his face, plastered dust to his hair, but there was a grin spreading across his mouth. The kind of grin a man wears after gambling with death and winning. He pointed at Brenner with 2 fingers. "You," he said between breaths, "are a damned magician." Brenner felt heat rise in his face. How'd she run? Hart slid off the wing, boots hitting the ground. More. Temp gauge barely twitched. No knocking. No vapor lock. Nothing. He wiped his brow. "Hal, that mix of yours, it shouldn't work." Brenner swallowed. But it did. Hart stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I pushed her hard. Went hotter, went higher. If she was gonna blow, she'd have blown on that climb." He clapped a hand on Brenner's shoulder. "You just gave us altitude back." Behind them, the other mechanics stared in stunned silence. A few shook their heads in disbelief. One muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." The desert breeze carried the smell of cooling metal and hot glycol through the air. It wasn't the smell of regulation. It was the smell of something new, something the squadron had never had before. An edge. Hart glanced toward the other parked Lightnings. "Load every bird with it." Doyle hesitated. "The colonel won't approve experimental mix." Hart shrugged. "Then don't tell him it's experimental." Brenner felt his stomach twist. "Hart, if something goes wrong, then it's on me." Hart interrupted. "But if it goes right? Those boys will finally climb above the enemy instead of praying their engines don't boil halfway up." Brenner knew the argument was already over. The pilots were listening now, and every pair of eyes on that flight line carried the same silent message. Whatever that mixture was, they needed it. The squadron needed it. The war needed it. And the enemy had no idea what was coming. Word travels fast on a flight line, faster than fuel trucks, faster than orders, faster even than fear. By the afternoon, every pilot in the squadron had heard what happened with Hart's test flight. They circled around Brenner's workspace in small groups, pretending to check their gear or waiting for maintenance updates. But their eyes never left the row of coolant drums lined up against the hangar wall. It wasn't curiosity. It was hope. Hope that maybe, finally, They could climb higher than the enemy without watching their temperature needles rise like countdown timers. Brenner, exhausted but steady, oversaw the first refills. One by one, the lightnings rolled into the bay. Mechanics in grease-stained shirts swapped coolant lines, flushed old fluid, and poured in Brenner's mixture with a reverence usually reserved for ammunition or morphine. Doyle kept watch at the hangar door, keeping stray officers at bay with excuses that grew thinner by the hour. Hart leaned against a wing strut, arms crossed as he watched the process unfold. His earlier bravado had quieted into something more serious. He knew what they were doing wasn't regulation, it wasn't even close, but the war wasn't checking manuals, and neither was the enemy. "Think they'll hold under full squadron load?" Doyle asked quietly. Brenner took a slow breath. "If Hart's run didn't break it, nothing down here will." "Down here," Doyle muttered, "isn't up there." Brenner didn't argue. He couldn't. Every altitude gain, every high-power dive, every heavy turn the squadron made would be another test of his mixture. He had given them a tool, but the sky would decide whether it was a blessing or a curse. By late afternoon, 10 aircraft were ready. Their silver skins gleamed under the desert sun, freshly fueled, freshly armed, freshly cooled. The pilots gathered for a mission briefing, though it felt more like a silent vigil. The briefing hut was stifling, the air heavy with anticipation and the scent of sweat and dust. The operations officer stepped aside, giving way to the squadron commander, Major Pierce. He was a stern man with an expression that rarely changed, but even he sensed something in the air. "You're intercepting a high-altitude reconnaissance run," Pierce said, pointing at the map. "Intelligence says they've started sending fighters as escort." He looked around the room. "You'll need every foot of altitude you can steal." The pilots exchanged glances, quick, nervous, but with a fire building behind their eyes. Hart caught Brenner's gaze through the open doorway and gave a subtle nod, as if to say, "You gave us a shot, we're taking it." The briefing ended. Boots thumped across the floorboards. The squadron spilled into the sun, helmets under their arms, oxygen masks hanging loose. Engines began to cough and sputter awake, each one sending a deep vibration through the ground. Brenner stood near Hart's lightning as the pilot climbed the ladder. "Listen," Brenner said, voice low. "I need you to remember if anything feels off, anything at all." "I'll bring her back." Hart finished for him. That mix wasn't made for combat power sustained at altitude. If the glycol balance shifts... Hart reached up, grabbing Brenner's wrist. "Hal, you saved our engines this morning. Let us fight with them tonight." There was nothing left to say. Hart pulled the canopy shut. The engines roared. One by one, the lightnings turned onto the taxiway, forming a shimmering line of silver stretched across the dirt. The dust swirled in their wake, drifting over Brenner's boots and settling on his sleeves. He didn't brush it off. The lead aircraft accelerated first, wheels rattling over the uneven strip before lifting into the sky, then the next, then the next. Soon the entire squadron rose together, climbing into the fading light with the confidence of men who believed they might finally have an edge. Brenner squinted upward until the last glint of sun caught the final aircraft's wingtip. Only then did he realize his hands were shaking. Because the truth was simple. This time, he wasn't afraid of failure. This time, he was afraid of what would happen if the mixture actually worked, because it meant the squadron would fly higher, fight harder, and take risks they'd never dared before. And that meant the war was about to change. The hangar settled into an uneasy quiet after Hart's landing, the kind of silence that comes after a miracle no one wants to speak too loudly about. Mechanics pretended to go back to work, but their hands moved slower, their eyes drifting toward Brenner as if he had suddenly grown taller. Word of Hart's flight spread across the field long before Brenner made it back to his toolbox. Men he barely knew nodded at him in passing. A few clapped him on the shoulder. One simply said, "About damn time," and walked away. But admiration wasn't what Brenner felt. It was the weight, heavy, invisible, tightening around his ribs with every passing minute. He had proven it worked on one plane. Now dozens of men wanted to trust it with their lives. Doyle found him standing beside the second P-38 inches line, holding a wrench he hadn't used for the last 10 minutes. "You look like you're staring down a firing squad," Doyle said gently. Brenner exhaled. "We're about to load 10 aircraft with something I made in a drum at midnight. I'd say that's close." "Hal," Doyle said, "you didn't throw darts at a board. You figured it out." He tapped the fuselage with the back of his knuckles, and Hart proved it. "That was one flight," Brenner muttered. "Yeah," Doyle replied. "One flight higher and hotter than any of them have gone in weeks." The conversation ended when the pilots began returning from the briefing hut, helmets under their arms, expressions sharp and restless. The mood had shifted. There was momentum in their walk, a current pulling all of them toward something bigger than an escort mission. Hart approached first, rolling his shoulders like a man loosening up before a fight. "How many ready?" he asked. "2 filled. 3rd draining," Doyle replied. Hart nodded. "Good. Load mine first for the mission." Brenner swallowed. "We haven't fully cycled." "It held at altitude," Hart said firmly. "Held under dive. Held under climb. If it didn't fail then, it won't fail now. I'm worried about what happens if you trust it too much." Hart leaned in closer. "Hal, we've been losing altitude to the enemy for months. If your mix gives us back even 2,000 feet, it's worth it." Before Brenner could respond, Major Pierce walked by, glancing at the row of open engine bays. "Everything ready for the afternoon run?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Doyle answered quickly, stepping between Pierce and the coolant drums. "Just last-minute checks." Pierce nodded, satisfied, and moved on. The moment he was out of earshot, every mechanic exhaled at once. Brenner wiped his hands and took a position beside the fuel truck, watching the lightnings being armed belts of 50 cal rounds fed into wing bays, cannon shells loaded with metallic clunks, drop tanks latched into place. It all moved with practiced efficiency, but something felt different to him now. These planes suddenly looked like they had more fight in them. As the sun dipped lower, the squadron began forming on the taxiway. Engines rumbled to life one after another, twin propellers chopping the air into vibrating rings that spread across the field. The ground trembled under Brenner's feet. Hart climbed into his cockpit and gave Brenner a quick nod through the glass. It wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't gratitude. It was something else. A promise. The canopy sealed with a metallic thump. The engines surged. The aircraft lurched forward. One by one, the P-38 seconds rolled out silver bodies catching the last streaks of daylight, engines harmonizing into a sound that felt like a heartbeat magnified across the desert. Brenner watched them accelerate down the strip, engines roaring in unison, dust rising in their wake like a banner. Then the first set of wheels left the ground, then the second, then the third. Before long, the entire squadron was airborne, climbing together in a slow, spiraling ascent toward the fading blue above. Brenner shaded his eyes with his hand, following them until they became glittering flecks, rising into a sky that had once betrayed them. He didn't feel pride. He felt fear. And hope. And something he hadn't felt since the war began. The sense that for once, the enemy might be the one outmatched. The lightnings had been gone for less than an hour when the first radio calls started filtering back through the operations. Fragmented bursts of sound carried across long-range channels, distorted by distance and thin air. Brenner wasn't supposed to be inside, but no one bothered to push him out. Everyone who had a stake in the mission had drifted toward the shack, pulled in like filings to a magnet. Most of the transmissions came through as static, but every so often a clear phrase punched through. Angels 3 to 8. Still climbing. Contact. Tally 3. Maybe 4. Break. Lefties overshooting. The room went still at that one. The notion of a Messerschmitt overshooting a P-38 during a climb would have been laughable a week earlier. Now men exchanged uncertain glances. Pierce stood over the radio operator's shoulder, arms crossed so tightly the fabric of his shirt strained at the seams. Brenner lingered near the door, pulse thumping against his ribs. He could feel the eyes of other mechanics flick toward him now and then, as if every transmission was a judgment on him personally. Then a voice cut through the static, strong, breathless, unmistakable. Heart to base coming in hot, 2 on me. But listen, she's holding. The operator's hands froze over the dials. Pierce stepped closer. Heart, say again. Repeat last. The reply came ragged, broken by engine noise and wind. She's holding at 40, maybe 42. Temps, steady mix is. Mix is doing it. No one spoke. It felt like the air had shifted, like the entire room leaned forward at once. Then another voice burst through. Viper, 2 splashed 1. Climb recovery smooth. No overheat. Brenner closed his eyes. Not out of relief. Not yet. It was something sharper, deeper, like bracing for a wave he knew was about to crash. Outside, the horizon was deepening into the copper color of late afternoon, when the first shapes appeared tiny at first, glints of metal against the dusk. Someone shouted from the flight line. Men spilled out of the shack as the returning P-38 seconds grew larger, their silhouettes unmistakable in the falling light. Hart's plane came in first, dropping fast, wings rocking as if carried by adrenaline alone. His landing was rougher than usual, wheels screeching against the earth, but the plane stayed together, engines winding down in a steady, healthy whine. Brenner started walking before he realized he had moved. Hart climbed down from the cockpit, pulling off his oxygen mask, face flushed with cold and exertion. He was breathing hard, but he was grinning wide, open, boyish, the grin of a man who had glimpsed something impossible and lived to tell it. Before anyone could speak, he pointed at Brenner. Hal, your damn mix just let me chase a bandit uphill. Brenner felt something in his chest loosen, then tighten again. You chased him? No, Hart said, shaking his head with a kind of stunned amusement. I caught him. The other pilots gathered around, still unstrapping, still half trembling from the fight. Their faces were lit with a fierce, bewildered energy. One pilot, Langston, usually quiet, stepped forward. I took a burst in the radiator line, he said. Would have blown a normal coolant load, should have cooked the engine. Brenner's stomach dropped. But it didn't. Langston continued. Temp spiked, then leveled, held steady all the way home. The mechanics stared at Brenner with a strange mixture of fear and admiration, as if he'd cracked a secret he had no business understanding. Hart clapped a hand on his shoulder. Whatever you made, it worked. Better than you know. But Brenner's mind wasn't celebrating. It was climbing with every word, climbing past the exhilaration, climbing toward the questions that came after any breakthrough. What was the limit? Was there a limit? And what would happen if they pushed past it? The celebration fizzled slowly as the night deepened, replaced by a quiet hum of work debriefings, repairs, refueling. Pilots headed to the briefing hut. Mechanics dispersed among the engines, pulling panels and checking lines. Brenner stayed with Hart's aircraft, running his fingers along the coolant pipes, feeling the warmth radiating through the metal. Doyle joined him, wiping his hands on a rag. "You don't look thrilled," Doyle said. "I'm trying to figure out what I missed," Brenner replied. Doyle frowned. "Hal, they all came back. That's what scares me." Doyle stared at him, puzzled. Brenner lowered his voice to a whisper. "If we can climb to 42, maybe higher, the engines are going where they were never tested. And if the coolant holds at that altitude, something else will be the next thing to fail." Doyle's expression shifted curiosity, then realization. "You think we bought them altitude they shouldn't reach?" Brenner nodded, eyes fixed on the cooling engine. Kelly Johnson's numbers said the aircraft was structurally sound at those heights. But numbers aren't the same as combat. Doyle leaned against the wing, thoughtful. "What do you want to do?" Brenner took a long breath, then exhaled slowly. "Tomorrow, we watch every plane like it's one bolt away from tearing itself apart." Doyle nodded, but inside, both men knew something else. Altitude was power, power was temptation, and the pilots had tasted it now. The mix had changed the aircraft. What Brenner feared was that it might also change the men who flew them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And do.